Okay, so I'm going to do a little demonstration, an example, alright, of how much I listen, how much I remember, and how much ultimately a whole bunch of not my problem ends up going ahead and getting shoveled on by the people who are the problem. Alright? So let's go ahead and talk about Mother Dearest. Alright? The same one that believes that after having me in therapy the entirety of my childhood, that I should now go and seek therapy when the root of the problem that ended up happening that caused so much fallout that it quite literally almost caused an international criminal conspiracy and, diplomatic crisis. Alright? So, my mother ended up going ahead and being born in Queens, alright? She ended up living there, I believe it was until 13 years old. The reason why was because of the factor that, first example, when she was at the apartment complex she ended up living in, she ended up getting jumped by 10 black boys, as she ends up going ahead and stating, which ended up, whether or not she realizes it, caused some internalized racism, alright? When she pretty much ended up working the entirety of her childhood, having to go ahead and do all the chores, while also having three brothers who did none of the work because it was believed that, that was women's work. Very misogynistic father who ended up going ahead and becoming a heroin addict and was actually one of the first AIDS cases diagnosed in the United States because of, sharing a dirty heroin needle. That's for later on. But ultimately, every time that Raymond, Johnny, or Ralphie ended up getting in trouble or causing some type of problem, my mom would end up going ahead and being the one having to take the beating for them. Alright? Now keep in mind, she was taking an ass whooping for her, she was taking an ass whooping for the three of them. Alright? But her father was so abusive that he would go ahead, take the belt, and start whooping her ass. Quote unquote. Just in case she would think about doing something wrong. Alright? Now, her mother was a complete and total egomaniac who ultimately, obviously very problematic dynamic between the mother and the father because of the fact that she was upset that she ended up getting pregnant young. So because she got pregnant young and it was at a much earlier time, she was forced to stay with the man despite the factor of his abusiveness. Alright? I believe she was 14 or so when she had the oldest, who I believe the oldest was Raymond. Alright? Now, when my mom was, young because of that, ultimately the only reprieve that she would have would be to go to Titi Letty's house, the summer house, which was on Long Island. Alright? So during the summer, she'd be able to go there, be able to actually have some peace, a little bit in her life. Well, you know, pretty much all the chaos was still going on at home for everyone else where they were living in Queens. When she was 13 and she was, legal to be able to go and, actually be able to help out with the family business, which was a hair salon, my mom would have to go ahead and sweep up the salon and everything. She didn't get paid for it, not to mention that, but while she was working, her mom went and gave her the threat and the warning, don't tell anyone that I'm your mom. Alright? So when she was at work, it was quite literally Evelyn. When it was at home, it was mom. Alright? And keep in mind, too, it was quite literally child exploitation and labor. Alright? So, My mom ended up going ahead and doing that throughout her childhood, throughout her teen years. Ended up going ahead and learning how to do hair. When she was in high school, she ended up going ahead and getting her first boyfriend. It was this guy named Cesar. Later on, Cesar ended up becoming, an Air Force pilot, you know? Ultimately, at that point, my mom had to go ahead and think about her, future ambitions. She had wanted to go to college, but her father wouldn't let her because, you know, your place is at home in the kitchen, or your place is at home doing woman's work. There's no room for women in the workforce. That type of mentality. So ultimately, her dreams of going to college would end up getting crushed until much later. All right. When she was very much so into the disco scene when she was a teenager and everything. And there was actually a point of music history that my mom ended up almost being at. She had actually gotten invited because of her friend's relative being, part of the production team for the Ed Sullivan Show. So she had actually gotten a ticket to be able to attend. When? When the Beatles ended up being introduced to the United States. But she, despite having the ticket, she was not able to go ahead and go to that show because her option was to go to that show or forfeiting her ticket to be there for her friend. Why did she need to be there for her friend? Because her friend ended up getting raped and stabbed. So she had to go to the friend's family and actually let them know what happened, try to get emergency assistance as soon as possible, because every passerby was willing to just let her go ahead and bleed out. So that ended up being a shocking reality and ended up being, from a side point, the realization that the world isn't safe, which ended up causing quite a bit of her neuroses. Alright? Then she ended up going ahead and dating this other guy because her and Cesar wasn't together anymore. This guy named Randy. Alright? Now, Randy, he was a very attractive man, but at the same time, he had no capability of fidelity. Alright? A notorious womanizer. She ended up going ahead and wanting to try to make that relationship work because, let's be real, she was completely infatuated and, she viewed him as dreamy. Ultimately, she ended up in a situation where she had her own personal experience with sexual assault, by a random mugger. Yeah, so that ended up causing her to have a lot of issues that she had to struggle with, which ended up turning her to religion. All right. She ended up starting her walk with religion back when she was about 21 years old. All right. And because of her walk with religion and seeing the way that Randy was living, she had to go ahead and cut him loose because of the factor she couldn't live in sin that way. All right. So from 21 until 26, she continued working for her mom while simultaneously trying to do what she could to be able to obtain her freedom. Her father made it very difficult, damn near impossible, because he would use every manipulation and control tactic to try to prevent her from having any type of independence. The way that she ended up gaining her independence was actually having a chance being given to her to be able to rent a small basement apartment by this lady named Mickey. Alright? So after she ended up going and getting that apartment, she ended up finding herself pregnant. She got married to this abusive man who was actually, not a United States citizen. Alright? He was from Costa Rica. She wanted to go ahead and come back home because he would constantly beat on her. All right, and she tried reaching out to her mom, and her mom was like, "No, you made your choice. Like you got married. You got married. Our job is done." Well, she ended up going ahead and getting pregnant with my older sister. So, because of the factor of how much of a danger he was, when she ended up getting pregnant, he wanted to do nothing for her. All right, he would go ahead and go to his sister's house constantly for dinner. Steak and potatoes. Like instead of actually, acknowledging her contributions. So eventually, she was able to go ahead and get him to run off by going ahead and clarifying the fact that financially she wasn't going to take being financially exploited. So, once the courts ended up stepping in, and was ready to throw the book at him when it came to child support, he ended up going ahead and running back to Costa Rica until my sister was old enough for him to no longer be on the hook for child support. All right. Now, after my mom ended up having my older sister, she ended up 4 years later having me. All right. So she was 27 when she had my sister, and she was 32. Wait, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. She was either 31 or 32 when she ended up having me. All right. Well, my sister was a very easy going birth, very natural, just, no complications. When it came to me, I had an overgrown head that they literally needed a medical suction cup to be able to get my head out of, the birth canal. All right. Ultimately, my umbilical cord ended up going ahead and wrapping around my neck. And because of the factor of how big my head was in diameter, it ended up ripping her open, causing her to end up needing to be stitched up because, both holes ended up turning into one hole. So surgeons needed to make it two holes again. But the way she ended up having me was she ended up meeting this guy that was next door, in the house next door, in the house in Long Island. And the guy's name was Robert Tabak. All right, Robert Tabak was a construction worker who ended up going ahead and being really nice to my mom and everything. But what my mom didn't know was the factor that Robert quite literally was in a relationship, and was constantly pulling, sneaky infidelity games. Now, it's still a debate whether or not my mom was the quote-unquote side chick or third party, or if my mom was, the main chick, which has ended up going ahead and causing tenacity between me and my half-sister, who, keep in mind, my half-sister has sisters of her own. That's a story for another day. But she ended up going ahead and at least not being married to Robert, which ended up being a blessing in disguise. Now, when Robert ended up finding out that she was pregnant with me, he wanted nothing to do with her. All right? So in her eyes, because he wanted her to get an abortion, she had her choice, and her choice was to have me. So, in spirit, he ended up aborting me. So I was born a bastard. So, when he ended up coming back around, because he was also a drunk, he ended up one day driving drunk, came to go see her, said he wants to see his son, and she says, "You don't have a son." All right? So then she ends up telling him the wrong name, not telling him my actual name. So that way, when he went back to the bar that he frequented and would go and talk about his son, everybody but him knew what my name was. But this is part one of my mother's entire life story. All right, because apparently I don't listen to people's trauma or their experiences, because I'm completely and apparently utterly self-involved. All right, keep in mind this with how long it is. It's going to be a YouTube exclusive series.